Good evening, my friends. It's Palm Sunday, and I shared with you that I'm going to do a daily meditation each day this week, working through Holy Week with you. These are just thoughts I've really kind of had in myself, and I thought, gosh, I'll just share them with the group. These will be brief, 10, 15 minutes, just mostly kinds of ideas for you as you work biblical text. So the first thing I would like to do is obviously observe that it's Sunday night, all the sermons are done, so I can't help you with your sermons if you're a pastor. But I know that a lot of you would have observed what is kind of standard for the last 20 years or so, and that's the contrast between Jesus riding on a colt, a small animal, and a war horse, as would be expected of a king, yada yada. We have become sensitive to empire. This is true. This is something that's perhaps been going on, been happening since the 1960s. Really, I think you can trace this kind of thing to Jürgen Moltmann, in particular, Jacques Ellul. It would be another figure, even Karl Barth to some extent, Walter Wink for sure. There's any number of others. Oscar Kuhlman could be mentioned in this group. And a number of others, great New Testament scholars as well as theologians. They recognize that this empire thing, the state, in Barth's language, the state, is not the be-all and end-all. It's a penultimate reality. What you don't find, though, in these traditions is a recognition that the state is a humanly constructed reality. Most of these Christian theologians tend to go to some kind of orders of creation kind of thinking, that in the beginning God made family, church, state, and work, labor. And those are the orders of creation, rather than seeing all of those as the direct result of the victimage mechanism and ritualization of the human species. So that also leads me to conclude that most of the persons who are going to do Jesus didn't ride it on a war horse, Jesus was against an empire, we're going to go stand against the United States government, blah, blah, blah. And they do all this kind of logic. What they don't realize is how embedded in empire they are. And the Johannine writer gives you clues to all of this. He really does. Particularly when you get to the so-called triumphal entry. When Jesus rides in on a colt. And he says in chapter 12, verse 16, at first his disciples did not understand all this. Well, that's the same stuff. If you're following my Gospel of John series on my personal page where I'm going verse by verse through the Gospel, this is the same thing that's been said twice in chapter 2, once specifically with reference to Jesus in the temple, the cleansing of the temple, so-called cleansing of the temple, and at the miracle, the wedding at Cana, the so-called miracle at the sign, the Semea at Cana. And this is what I keep trying to stress in those studies, as long as we come to the biblical text and think we get it, as long as it confirms our theological thinking, we're not listening. The biblical text should consistently and constantly challenge us to rethink everything we think. Or we're not listening to it. Okay? It's not that it's not doing its job. Its job is already there when it was put together as a collection of two canons. I mean, that's its job. It's there. Are we seeing what's happening in these texts? Is the question. And the writer says, no, we don't. And it takes time. And so really the first thing I mean, if I was going to have preached this morning, I would, of course, only been invited to preach in more liberal churches, like a UCC church, perhaps, or a United Methodist Church. I don't get invited to preach these days. But I would have said, we're so comfortable criticizing empire that we fail to recognize our own embeddedness in it. And then I would start naming the ways in which we progressives and liberals, so to speak, are embedded in empire. And I wish that crowd would do that to itself, to its own people, to its own group, rather than just assuming that the conservative evangelicals are the only ones mired in empire. And that's how I would have certainly approached this text. But from what I want to do this week, um, it's not focus on that at all. Is focus on how the writer of the Gospel of John will structure the final week of Jesus. And the key here is to remember that the cleansing of the temple in John's Gospel is at the beginning. And I suggested when I exegeted that text that there is perhaps more historical weight to be given to that rather than seeing it as some kind of final act that gets Jesus in trouble. There's a number of reasons why. But I suggested that, which means that if we follow the sequence of the Gospel of John, when Jesus returns to Bethany, when he comes back down south, it is the raising of Lazarus from the dead that's going to create all the trouble for him. Because not only in chapter 11 is Lazarus raised, but there is now a plot that immediately follows to kill Jesus. And the writer says Jesus could no longer move about publicly among the Judeans. He couldn't do it. His life was in danger. He was a known quantity. Many went up for the Jewish Passover and were looking for Jesus. They stood in the temple area and said, "What do you think? Is he coming to the feast? Is he coming? Is he, And then the chief priests and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone found out where Jesus was, he should report it so they might arrest him. And here they are, man. They're infiltrating the crowds. They're listening to conversations in the temple. People are asking about Jesus, and these temple guards and others and the priests and Levites are perking their ears up. What information can they take to their national security expert there in the temple to make sure that this particular troublemaker doesn't make any more trouble? But immediately following that, there's a crowd comes to the feast. Here's Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and they run out to meet him. And they do the whole Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. Now, you can easily gloss over that business about kingship, but the writer of the fourth gospel has already indicated to you back in chapter 6, after the feeding of the 5,000 in the wilderness, that the crowd at that point wanted to make him king. And it's immediately at that point that Jesus knows his life is over. It's forfeit. There can only be one king, and that's Herod. That is not him. And, of course, in the synoptic narratives, the feeding of the 5,000 leads Jesus and his immediate group of followers on a flight to Caesarea Philippi into Gentile territory, where Jesus goes, "Holy cow, who do the people think I am?" And they don't get it, and he has to help the disciples at that point begin to try to understand that his death sentence has been sealed at that point, and they don't get it. They don't want to buy that, and we see that in the Markan narrative in chapter 8. So when this writer says, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the King of Israel," he's making a very powerful statement about Jesus and Jesus' relationship to Israel, and the fact that it will be the king that is crucified. Well, what's key here again? Think about this in terms of mimetic theory. Where does ancient kingship stem from? It stems from sacrificial victimage. As the process of victimage began to be expanded and a victim was pre-selected ahead of time, and the social group would eventually, over time, that one would be elevated prior to their real divinization after they were immolated and cannibalized. But here, the king is now the person who's set free from all the laws and taboos, and so they're violating them right and left. That's what this, in some cultures it's a young couple, in some cultures it's a king figure. They violate all the taboos, and then at the end, when it's time, the group has a justification for saying why this one has to die, because he violated all the taboos. But they told him to, but they don't want to admit that. This business about kingship here, Jesus is also exposing on the cross the false way humans create kings. And if we are sensitive to the Gospel of John, we know already back in the previous chapter, Caiaphas had come out and said, "You don't realize the proper way to keep this thing going is to let one man die. Just let him die. It doesn't matter. He's just one guy. He's just one guy. Doesn't matter." Otherwise, we don't do that, Romans are going to come down on us because they're going to be afraid of potential trouble. They don't want any of these troublemakers. That's what we really have going on here in this Palm Sunday thing, is the total reconstruction of what constitutes kings. And you got to stop and think about this. We're not talking about presidents and prime ministers. We're talking about those that get anointed kings in the Christian community. Big speakers, well-known figures that are all anointed out there as kings. The Bill Johnsons, the Bethel types. And they all sit and anoint each other. And then you got it in the church as well, and certainly runs rampant in progressive Christianity. This whole kingship thing, this whole thing about Christendom, we've got backwards. It's not our place to go seeking power and fame and fortune and all the stuff that goes with kingship. Because the one that's king is easy made scapegoat. And we're starting to see that with Mr. Trump. Of course he's shooting himself in his own foot. Of course he is. But we're going to use all that as leverage against him. And we're going to scapegoat him as a people. It's inevitable. This country needs a scapegoat in the worst way. We really do. And that's what we do. And we can see the mimetic conflicts just pouring out of us as a nation, with school shootings every week. And it's astonishing. It's amazing. So Palm Sunday, what is Palm Sunday about? What are we really, really celebrating today? We're celebrating the entry of light into darkness. That's what we're celebrating. And we know that the darkness will reject the light. And we also know that the light will overcome the darkness. Good Friday, Easter. This is Holy Week. It's about our reception or non-reception of the light. Well, I'll wish you a great